Marcus Davis loved moments like these, quiet, unhurried, and completely his own. After another grueling practice with the New York Rockets, his body was sore, but his mind was finally at ease. The silence in his car, apart from the faint hum of the engine, was a welcomed break from the constant chatter of the court, the roaring fans, and the relentless media attention that followed him everywhere. His SUV, a black, custom-fitted luxury model, glided through the winding streets of an upscale neighborhood. He'd bought this car as a gift to himself after securing his first major endorsement deal. It was more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of how far he'd come, from playing ball on the cracked courts of his old neighborhood to now being one of the most sought-after players in the league. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the manicured lawns and towering trees that lined the road. He adjusted his sunglasses, relishing the stillness of the moment, when something in his rearview mirror caught his eye. A police cruiser keeping pace behind him. Marcus didn't think much of it at first. After all, he wasn't speeding or doing anything that would warrant attention. But as the cruiser remained behind him, matching his every turn and lane change, a familiar, uneasy feeling began to creep in. Marcus had been in this situation before. It was a silent understanding he'd developed over the years. A subtle shift in the air whenever he found himself in certain neighborhoods, driving certain cars. His heart rate quickened as the cruiser's lights flashed suddenly, the red and blue colors reflecting in his rearview mirror like a warning. The shrill sound of the siren pierced the quiet, cutting through the calm he had been enjoying just moments before. His stomach sank, a knot forming deep in his gut. He signaled and slowly pulled over to the side of the road, parking under the shadow of a large oak tree. Marcus kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, fingers gripping the leather tightly. He had heard enough stories of routine stops that quickly turned into something far worse. He didn't want to take any chances. The cruiser parked behind him, and through his side mirror, Marcus watched as the officer, a stern-looking man with graying hair and a stiff posture, stepped out of the vehicle. The officer's face was unreadable, but there was something about his body language that immediately made Marcus tense. The officer approached slowly, his eyes scanning the car before he even reached the window. Marcus could feel the weight of the man's gaze, and for a moment it felt as though every part of him was under scrutiny. The car, his clothes, his very presence in this neighborhood. A quick knock on the window jolted Marcus out of his thoughts. He pressed the button to lower the window, taking a deep breath as the cool evening air filled the cabin. The officer leaned in slightly, his face expressionless, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. "License and registration," the officer said flatly, his tone sharp and devoid of warmth. Marcus immediately reached for the documents, careful to move slowly. He had practiced this in his mind before, keeping his actions deliberate, his voice calm. He didn't want to give the officer any reason to feel threatened or suspicious, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. Handing over his license and registration, Marcus met the officer's gaze, though the man still hadn't taken off his sunglasses. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice steady. The officer glanced at the documents briefly before shifting his attention back to Marcus. His frown deepened, and Marcus could sense the unspoken question hovering in the air. "This your car?" the officer asked, though it didn't sound like a question. It sounded more like an accusation. Marcus had expected this. He had been through it enough times to know where this was going. His car, sleek, black, and expensive, didn't fit the profile the officer had in mind for someone like him, a black man in this part of town. "Yes, it's my car," Marcus replied, keeping his tone as neutral as possible. "Is there something wrong?" The officer ignored his question, taking another long look at Marcus, as if sizing him up. "What do you do for a living?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he finally removed his sunglasses, revealing a cold, calculated expression. The question wasn't born out of curiosity. Marcus could feel the layers beneath it, the assumptions, the doubt. He knew the officer didn't expect the answer he was about to give. "I'm a professional basketball player. I play for the New York Rockets," Marcus said calmly, though he knew the name wouldn't mean much to the officer. He had faced this kind of skepticism before. No matter how much success he achieved, there were always people who looked at him and saw something else, something that didn't belong. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You got any proof of that?" Marcus felt his chest tighten. He could feel the frustration building, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to escalate the situation. "I can show you my registration." "Everything's in order," he offered, but the officer wasn't listening. "I'll need you to step out of the vehicle," the officer said, stepping back slightly, giving Marcus room to comply. Marcus hesitated for a moment. He had done nothing wrong. This stop should have been routine, over in minutes. But here he was, being asked to get out of his own car, for no apparent reason. Still, he knew refusing would only make things worse. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out onto the sidewalk. The officer eyed him carefully, his hand resting casually on his belt, as if preparing for trouble. Marcus stood tall, his 6'7" frame towering over the officer, but he made sure his movements were slow and non-threatening. "Turn around," the officer instructed, and Marcus complied, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, searching for any excuse to escalate the situation. The minutes dragged on as the officer ran his information through the system. Marcus stood by his car, staring at the passing cars, wondering what they thought when they saw him there. A wealthy black man in an expensive car, being questioned by the police. It wasn't a new story, but it still stung every time it happened. Finally, the officer returned, his expression unchanged. "You say you're a basketball player, huh?" he said, holding up Marcus's license. "How about you show me something that proves that?" Marcus let out a slow breath, nodding toward the back seat where his gym bag sat. "I've got my team gear in the bag. You can check it if you want." The officer didn't respond, but he glanced at the back seat. His curiosity piqued. Marcus knew it wasn't enough. Marcus stood beside his car, the weight of the officer's scrutiny heavy on his shoulders. The air was still, but his pulse raced as if the tension alone could crack the pavement beneath him. He knew this scene all too well. A routine traffic stop for some, but a minefield of assumptions for others. Every move he made felt calculated, deliberate, a dance he had learned to survive in moments like these. The officer, whose badge now gleamed in the fading sunlight, still hadn't shifted from his suspicious posture. He held Marcus's license in one hand, the other resting near his belt, as though ready for something more than a conversation. It was subtle but clear. The officer wasn't just asking questions. He was waiting for Marcus to make a mistake. "So you play for the Rockets?" The officer's tone was laced with disbelief. His eyes flicked between Marcus and the license, as though looking for cracks in the story that didn't exist. Marcus nodded, trying to stay calm. "Yeah, New York Rockets," he said again, wondering how long this charade would go on. He was no stranger to being questioned about his success, especially in spaces where he was an anomaly, but it didn't make it easier. Despite his fame, despite the millions who knew his name, moments like this made him feel invisible, like none of it mattered. The officer squinted, tapping his fingers against the license. "I don't think I've seen you on TV before," he remarked, his voice carrying a hint of a challenge. "And I follow basketball pretty closely." Marcus knew the game now. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. This was about making him prove something that wasn't on his license or registration. It wasn't enough that his name was Marcus Davis, that he played for the Rockets, or that he could afford the car he was driving. He had to show this officer that he belonged, that he wasn't what the officer's instincts told him he might be. "Maybe you've missed a few games," Marcus replied, his voice steady, though his patience was starting to thin. He glanced down the street, where the sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. It felt like time had slowed, each second dragging as he stood there, a player caught in the wrong kind of spotlight. The officer took a step closer, his brows furrowed. "What position do you play?" he asked, as if this was some sort of test. Marcus had to bite back his frustration. "Power forward," he said, keeping his tone neutral. He had learned long ago not to let moments like these break his composure. In his mind, he replayed the basics. Stay calm, be polite, don't give them a reason. The officer looked him up and down as if finally seeing the athlete standing before him. Marcus was built like a fortress, all muscle and height, his frame a testament to years of hard work. Still, the officer didn't seem convinced. "Must be nice, driving a car like this," the officer muttered, his eyes roaming over the sleek lines of Marcus's SUV. "How'd you afford it?" Marcus clenched his jaw. It was a loaded question, one that carried more weight than the officer probably intended to admit. The underlying assumption was clear. Someone like Marcus, a black man in a luxury vehicle, must have something to prove. He was being asked to justify his presence in this world of wealth and privilege, as if success alone wasn't enough. "I worked hard for it," Marcus replied, keeping his tone even. He refused to give the officer the satisfaction of seeing him flustered. Just like everyone else, the officer cocked his head, as though considering the response. He held Marcus's license loosely now, his demeanor shifting from outright suspicion to something more calculated. "A lot of folks don't just get lucky, you know," he said, his voice carrying a strange edge. "Not everyone plays basketball and makes millions." Marcus felt the weight of those words settle in the air between them. He wasn't lucky. He had fought for every inch of progress, every opportunity, every success. But here he was, reduced to answering condescending questions from someone who knew nothing about his journey. "I didn't get lucky," Marcus said quietly, his voice measured but firm. "I earned this." The officer regarded him for a moment, the silence growing thick. Marcus could feel the tension in the air, an unspoken challenge hanging between them. Then, with a slow shake of his head, the officer turned away, walking back toward his cruiser. Marcus didn't move, but his muscles tensed as he watched the officer disappear inside his car. A few moments later, the officer reappeared, his face grim. "Your license and registration check out," he said, but there was no apology in his tone. He seemed almost disappointed, as if he had been hoping to catch Marcus in a lie, to find some reason to justify his suspicions. Marcus took the documents back, resisting the urge to say anything more. He could feel the sting of the encounter settling into his bones, familiar and yet still painful. No matter how far he climbed, how much he accomplished, moments like these were a reminder that some people would always see him a certain way. Before Marcus could step back into his car, the officer glanced at him again, a strange look in his eyes. "You mind if I take a look inside the car?" he asked, though the way he phrased it wasn't really a question. Marcus felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. He had been polite, compliant, respectful. He had done everything right, and yet it still wasn't enough. Now the officer wanted to search his car, as if there was something to find, some justification for the way he had been treated. For a brief moment, Marcus considered refusing. He had every right to say no, but then he thought about the consequences, how quickly things could spiral if he didn't comply. He knew how these situations could turn. "Go ahead," Marcus said, stepping aside. The officer moved toward the car, slowly opening the door and peering inside. Marcus watched as he inspected the interior, checking the back seat, his hand brushing over Marcus's gym bag with the Rockets logo emblazoned on the side. "Find anything?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with the frustration he had been holding back. The officer didn't respond immediately, his eyes lingering on the bag for a moment longer before he stepped back. "No," he said finally, his tone flat. He closed the door and walked back toward Marcus, handing him his license. "You're free to go." Marcus took the license without a word, sliding it into his pocket. He turned to get into his car, but the officer spoke again, his voice low and hesitant this time. "Listen, I was just doing my job," the officer said, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. "You know how it is." Marcus paused, one hand on the car door. He knew exactly how it was, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. Without looking back, he said, "Yeah, I know." He got into the car, closing the door with a quiet thud. As he drove away, the officer watched him go, standing by his cruiser with a strange expression on his face, as if he wasn't quite sure what had just happened. For Marcus, it was just another reminder that respect, no matter how much he had earned, was still something he had to fight for. As Marcus drove down the road, he couldn't shake the lingering tension in his chest. He had been through these situations before, but it never got easier. It was always the same unspoken challenge. Prove yourself. Prove you belong here. Prove you're not what they assume you to be. The calm he had felt just moments earlier had vanished, replaced by the familiar frustration that came with these encounters. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he turned onto a quieter street, his mind replaying the interaction with the officer. He had done everything right, complied with every request, answered every question, and still it had ended with him feeling as though he had been put on trial. He glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the flashing lights again, but the road behind him was clear. The only sound now was the soft hum of his SUV's engine and the faint rush of wind outside the windows. Despite the officer's words, "You're free to go," Marcus didn't feel free. The interaction had left a mark, one that would take time to fade. As the city lights began to flicker on in the distance, Marcus's phone buzzed on the passenger seat, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw it was his agent, Greg. He hesitated for a moment, considering letting it go to voicemail, but he knew Greg would just keep calling until he answered. With a sigh, Marcus tapped the screen, activating the car's Bluetooth. "Hey, Greg," he said, his voice sounding more tired than he had intended. "Marcus, my man," Greg's voice boomed through the car's speakers, upbeat and full of energy. "Just checking in. Wanted to let you know we've got a meeting tomorrow morning with Nike. They're really excited about that new deal we've been working on." Marcus nodded, though Greg couldn't see him. "Sounds good," he replied, his tone flat. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Greg had known Marcus long enough to sense when something was off. "You okay, man? You sound off." Marcus exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Just had a run-in with the cops," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Nothing new. But, yeah." Greg was silent for a moment, then his tone shifted. "Damn, man. What happened?" Marcus recounted the stop, the officer's questions, the subtle accusations, and the search of his car. He kept his voice steady, but the frustration was clear in his words. Greg listened quietly, letting Marcus vent without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Greg sighed. "I'm sorry, man. That's messed up. Doesn't matter how successful you are, does it? People still see what they want to see." Marcus nodded again, though his grip on the steering wheel remained tight. "Yeah, that's how it goes," he muttered. Greg's voice softened. "Look, if you want me to get legal involved, we can do that. You shouldn't have to deal with this crap. We can push back." Marcus shook his head, though he knew Greg was just trying to help. "Nah, it's not worth it," he said. "It's over. I just want to forget about it." Greg hesitated, then finally relented. "All right, but if anything changes, let me know. You've got options, Marcus." "I know," Marcus replied. "Thanks, Greg." They talked for a few more minutes about the upcoming Nike meeting, with Greg filling him in on the details of the new endorsement deal. Marcus tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to the officer's face, the way he had looked at him with suspicion, as if waiting for Marcus to slip up. After the call ended, Marcus continued driving, the road ahead stretching out like a silent witness to the events of the day. The streets were nearly empty now, the city beginning to wind down for the night. The lights of downtown flickered in the distance, but Marcus barely noticed them. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment the officer had asked him to step out of the car. In those few seconds, Marcus had felt a familiar surge of emotions: anger, frustration, even fear, but he had pushed them down, knowing that any misstep could escalate the situation. He had learned to control his reactions, to stay calm even when he wanted to scream, but that control came at a cost. The officer's final words echoed in his mind. "Just doing my job. You know how it is." Yeah, Marcus knew exactly how it was. He knew that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much success he achieved, moments like this would always be a part of his life. It didn't matter that he was a professional athlete, that he had made a name for himself in the NBA. To some people, he would always be just another black man in a nice car. As he neared his apartment building, Marcus spotted a small group of kids playing basketball on a nearby court. The sound of the ball bouncing on the pavement caught his attention, and for a moment, he slowed down, watching them. They didn't notice him, too focused on their game, laughing and calling out plays to each other. Marcus smiled faintly, reminded of his own days spent on courts just like that one. Back then, the only thing that mattered was the game. No politics, no assumptions, no prejudices, just the pure love of basketball. He missed that sometimes, the simplicity, the freedom. He parked his SUV in the garage and sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. The night was quiet around him, but his mind was still racing, still caught up in the aftermath of the stop. He knew he should go inside, but something kept him rooted in the seat, his thoughts swirling. Eventually, he opened the door and stepped out, the cool night air hitting his skin. He grabbed his gym bag from the back seat and slung it over his shoulder, making his way toward the building. As he walked, he glanced back at the car, the officer's words still echoing in his ears. "Just doing my job." Marcus shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't the first time he had heard those words, and it wouldn't be the last. But no matter how many times he encountered it, the sting of being questioned, of being doubted, never seemed to dull. As he entered the building, the doorman greeted him with a friendly nod, clearly recognizing him. "Good evening, Mr. Davis," he said, smiling. "Rockets looking good this season." Marcus returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks, man," he replied, nodding as he made his way to the elevator. Inside the elevator, Marcus leaned against the wall, his mind still replaying the events of the evening. He knew he would have to let it go, to move on, but that was easier said than done. Every time something like this happened, it chipped away at him, a reminder that no matter how far he had come, there were still battles he couldn't escape. As the elevator doors opened, Marcus stepped out into the hallway, heading toward his apartment. He unlocked the door and walked inside, the familiar surroundings offering some small comfort. But as he tossed his gym bag onto the couch and sat down, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's encounter had left a deeper mark than usual. He glanced at his phone, debating whether to text someone, maybe one of his teammates or even his mom, but decided against it. Instead, he leaned back on the couch, staring up at the ceiling, the weight of the evening settling over him like a heavy blanket. In moments like these, Marcus wondered if things would ever really change. Would there ever come a day when he didn't have to prove himself, when he didn't have to answer questions that should never have been asked in the first place? For now, all he could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time, knowing that the road to respect was still far from over. The following day brought with it a new focus: business. Despite the frustrations that lingered from his encounter with the officer, Marcus had to prepare himself for the Nike meeting. This deal was a big one, and Greg had worked tirelessly to set it up. It wasn't just about another endorsement. It was about continuing to build his legacy off the court. He knew the importance of securing long-term opportunities, especially in a career as unpredictable as professional sports. The morning air was crisp as Marcus stepped out of his apartment building, his mind already beginning to shift from the tension of the previous evening to the task at hand. He climbed into his SUV, the same car that had been the focus of so much unwarranted suspicion just hours earlier. He glanced in the rearview mirror out of habit, half expecting to see those flashing lights again. But today was different. Today, he was moving forward. As he pulled into traffic, he rehearsed the talking points Greg had drilled into him the night before. Product lines, brand synergy, public appearances, it was all part of the game now. Being an NBA star wasn't just about what you did on the court. It was about how you built your name, your image. And Marcus was determined to make sure his image was one of success, hard work, and integrity. He arrived at the Nike headquarters, greeted by a sea of polished glass and sleek architecture. Greg was waiting for him outside, leaning casually against a railing, his phone in hand. As soon as he saw Marcus, he waved, flashing that signature grin that meant things were looking good. "Marcus," Greg called out as Marcus approached. "You ready to make history today?" Marcus chuckled, shaking Greg's hand. "I'm ready," he said, though there was still a part of him that felt weighed down by the events of the night before. They walked inside together, making their way to a conference room where a group of Nike executives awaited them. The meeting began smoothly: presentations, slides, product pitches. Greg did most of the talking, which Marcus didn't mind. His role was simple: to be the face of the brand, to embody the values that Nike wanted to project. He answered a few questions about his training regimen, his goals for the season, but for the most part, he let Greg handle the business details. After about an hour, the meeting wrapped up, and it was clear that everything had gone well. The Nike team seemed enthusiastic about working with Marcus, and as they left the building, Greg couldn't hide his excitement. "That went better than I expected," Greg said, clapping Marcus on the back. "They love you, man. This deal is going to be huge." Marcus smiled, though the heaviness in his chest hadn't quite lifted. He appreciated Greg's enthusiasm, but his mind was elsewhere, still turning over the thoughts that had plagued him since the night before. "You all right?" Greg asked, noticing Marcus's distant expression. "Yeah, just still thinking about last night," Marcus admitted. "It just doesn't sit right, you know? You do everything right, but it's never enough." Greg nodded, his tone serious for the first time that morning. "I get it, man. I really do. And I know it's easy to say, but don't let it eat at you. You've worked hard for everything you've got. Don't let one person's ignorance take that away from you." Marcus appreciated the words, but they didn't quite reach the part of him that still felt raw. He knew Greg was right, but the sting of being reduced to nothing more than a suspicion still lingered. Later that day, as Marcus drove back through the city, he found himself taking a detour through the neighborhood where the traffic stop had occurred. It wasn't intentional at first. He was simply driving, letting his thoughts wander, when he realized where he was. As he passed the spot where the officer had pulled him over, the memories came flooding back. His heart racing, the officer's probing questions, the weight of those unspoken assumptions. And then, as if by some strange twist of fate, Marcus noticed a group of kids gathered on the sidewalk up ahead. They were pointing and whispering excitedly, clearly recognizing the car as it passed by. One of them, a boy in a basketball jersey, broke away from the group and ran toward the curb, waving his arms to get Marcus's attention. "Yo, Marcus," the boy shouted, his voice filled with excitement. "Marcus Davis, it's you." For a moment, Marcus was caught off guard. He hadn't expected to be recognized here, in this neighborhood, but the boy's enthusiasm was contagious. Marcus slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. As he rolled down the window, the boy's face lit up with awe. "Man, I knew it was you," the boy exclaimed, grinning from ear to ear. "I told my friends you drive a black SUV. They didn't believe me, but I knew it." Marcus smiled, feeling the tension in his chest ease slightly. "You know your stuff, huh?" he said, glancing at the group of kids who were now edging closer, still too shy to approach. The boy nodded eagerly. "I watch all your games. I want to be just like you when I get older. My name's Jaden." "Nice to meet you, Jaden," Marcus replied, leaning out the window slightly. "You play ball?" "Yeah," Jaden said, practically bouncing on his feet. "Every day after school. I'm working on my jump shot, trying to get it as smooth as yours." Marcus chuckled. "Keep working hard, Jaden. You'll get there. Just remember, it's not all about the points. It's about how you play the game, how you handle yourself on and off the court." Jaden nodded, soaking in every word. "I will. Thanks, Marcus." As Marcus prepared to drive away, Jaden's friends finally worked up the courage to approach, waving and calling out his name. Marcus gave them a thumbs up, his mood lightened by the encounter. For a few brief moments, the weight of the previous night seemed to lift, replaced by the pure joy of connecting with fans who saw him for who he was, not just a player, but a person who had worked hard to achieve his dreams. He drove away feeling lighter, the encounter reminding him of why he kept pushing, why he refused to let moments like the traffic stop define him. As long as there were kids like Jaden looking up to him, Marcus knew he had to keep going, to keep setting an example both on and off the court. But as he turned the corner and left the neighborhood behind, the reality of his situation settled back in. The kids had seen him for who he truly was, but the officer had not. That was the world Marcus lived in, one where he was constantly walking a line between being celebrated and being questioned. And while the recognition from the kids was heartening, Marcus knew it didn't erase the frustrations he still carried. Still, as he drove back toward his apartment, he realized that moments like these, small, meaningful interactions, were what kept him grounded. They reminded him that no matter what, he had a responsibility to those who looked up to him. He had a platform, a voice, and a chance to inspire the next generation. And maybe, just maybe, that was how real change would come. The drive home was quiet, but Marcus's mind was anything but. The excitement from Jaden and his friends had lifted his spirits, but the weight of the previous night's events lingered in his thoughts like a shadow that wouldn't fade. The encounter with the officer had chipped away at his sense of peace, reminding him that no matter how successful he became, he would always face those silent judgments, those assumptions about who he was and why he didn't belong. He pulled into the garage of his building and sat for a moment, staring at the dashboard. The SUV was more than just a car to him. It was a symbol of what he had achieved through years of dedication and hard work. But in that officer's eyes, it was something different, a mark of suspicion, a question of legitimacy. Marcus exhaled, running his hands over the steering wheel before stepping out of the vehicle. As he grabbed his gym bag from the back seat and made his way to the elevator, he couldn't help but replay the officer's words in his head. "Just doing my job." That phrase felt hollow, a poor excuse for what had been a clear display of bias. It wasn't just about the stop. It was about everything that came with it. The questions, the doubt, the constant need to prove himself. As he stepped out of the elevator and into his apartment, Marcus set down his bag and flopped onto the couch. The spacious living room was filled with trophies, awards, and memorabilia from his career, symbols of the life he had built. But in that moment, they felt like props in a play, reminders of how far he had come, yet how much further he still had to go. The thoughts swirled in his mind for hours, and by the time night had fallen, Marcus still hadn't found a way to shake the feeling of frustration. He knew he couldn't let it eat at him, but that was easier said than done. Eventually, he decided to step outside. The night air was cool, and the city skyline twinkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the quiet neighborhood below. As he stood on the balcony, he found himself thinking about the kids from earlier. Jaden and his friends. Their excitement had been so pure, so unaffected by the complexities of the world around them. In their eyes, Marcus was a hero, someone to look up to. That thought brought him some comfort. It reminded him of the impact he had on people, especially the younger generation. The way Jaden had lit up when he recognized Marcus wasn't something the officer could ever take away from him. It was in those moments when he could inspire someone that Marcus felt truly fulfilled. That was the real power of his platform, far beyond the money or fame. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Greg. "Just got the final paperwork from Nike. It's official. We're good to go. Let's celebrate soon." Marcus smiled faintly. It was good news, and normally he'd be thrilled, but the high of landing the deal wasn't hitting him the way it should. He typed back a quick response. "Thanks, Greg. Let's set something up." As he put his phone away, Marcus thought back to something his mother used to say. "You can't control how people see you, but you can control how you respond." She had always told him to focus on what he could change, not what he couldn't. He had taken that lesson to heart throughout his life, but sometimes, like now, it felt harder to put into practice. Deciding he needed to clear his mind, Marcus headed down to the building's gym. Working out had always been his way of pushing through mental blocks, of channeling frustration into something productive. The gym was empty, which suited him fine. He tossed his towel over the bench and started with some light stretching, the familiar movements helping him settle into a rhythm. As he moved through his routine, his mind began to focus. He pushed himself harder, lifting more than usual, each rep feeling like a release. The physical strain helped him shed the emotional weight he had been carrying all day. Sweat poured down his face, his muscles burning with the effort, but he kept going, determined to work out every last bit of frustration. Finally, after what felt like hours, he sat down on the bench, breathing heavily. The gym was silent, save for the sound of his own breath. The intensity of the workout had drained him, but in a good way. He felt clearer now, as though the fog had lifted. The world hadn't changed, he knew that. But something inside him had shifted. Marcus wiped the sweat from his face and leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. He thought about the kids again, how they had seen him not just as an athlete, but as someone to emulate. That was something real, something that mattered. It wasn't about proving himself to people like the officer who had stopped him. It was about setting an example for the people who looked up to him, who saw him as a symbol of what was possible. As he stood up and gathered his things, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't control the world, couldn't change how some people would always see him. But he could choose how he responded to it. He could focus on what truly mattered, his career, his fans, and the kids who needed to see that success was possible, no matter where you came from. When Marcus returned to his apartment, he felt different, lighter, more focused. He showered, changed into some comfortable clothes, and sat down on the couch. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from one of his teammates. "Yo, you good for practice tomorrow?" Marcus smiled. "Yeah, man. See you there." As the night stretched on, Marcus found himself thinking less about the officer and more about what came next. The Nike deal was secured, the season was in full swing, and his career was on a high. He had so much to be thankful for, so much to look forward to. But more than that, Marcus knew he had a responsibility, not just to his team or to his sponsors, but to the people who looked up to him. He couldn't let moments like that stop with the officer define him. He was bigger than that, stronger than that. The night was quiet now, and for the first time in hours, Marcus felt at peace. He had faced a challenge, and while it had left its mark, it hadn't broken him. Tomorrow he would step back onto the court with the same determination he always had. Because in the end, it wasn't about proving himself to the world. It was about proving to himself that he could rise above it. And that's exactly what he intended to do. Thanks for being part of our storytelling journey. If this tale resonated with you, don't miss out on the next adventure. Just click the video now. We value your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.